Welcome to the 68th Strand Group, and I'm the director, John Davis. Since January 2022, I think it was, we've been gently building a partnership between, it was first of all, the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and now the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, and the Strand Group at King's College London. We've had several great lectures on the history, the future of digital policy. And just gently, we've been trying to build behind the scenes too. And so I'm so excited by this. But next academic year, in September, we've got the first of the research projects will get underway, a history of British digital policy with our great returning member of the Strand Group, Sian Cleary. Now, Sian's also going to be the first part-time manager of our new Centre for Digital Policy. This is something that between King's and DSIT, we're gradually getting our ideas around because there actually isn't one in the country. Plenty of centres of cyber security, but not a centre for digital policy in the round. And this is something like most of what we do at the Strand Group, or certainly what we try, is small but really quite excellent. And so we're really looking for, we've got plenty of interested parties, as you might understand, but we're also looking for the widest possible involvement from industry, from government, from academia, more news as we have it. The other thing that the Strand Group is working really hard on at the moment is our new Masters programme, which goes live this autumn. If you're on social media, I do apologise, but we've got to saturate it. We've got to sell it, right? But, I'm really proud of this, and this is a different kind of audience to the one we normally get. So if you'll indulge me, we're going to show you a short video of what the new Masters will look like. Run VT, Martin. The MA in Government Studies at King's College London offers an unrivalled opportunity to get an insider's view as to how government really works.
The truth is, as I know, if you're a cabinet minister, if you're an advisor of the Treasury, it's not about textbooks and equations. It's not simply about being able to study the past. It's about understanding what's happening in complex ways, learning from the past, and then saying, on that basis, what is the right way forward in that decision for our country.
So we look at policy, what the government of the day is doing and why they're doing it. We also look at process, so how the decision making is happening, the machinery of government, and then we look at personality, so who are the individuals, what shaped them as people, how do they get on.
This MA programme has institutional partnerships with organisations like Number 10 Downing Street and the Treasury. What that means is that classes can take place in buildings like Number 10 Downing Street and the Treasury, but it also means that we have the highest profile guest practitioners come into the classroom and teach alongside our academics to give you an experience of how government really works in practice.
We are really trying to create a very dynamic learning environment. It's in person. You're going to be part of a small cohort, so you'll really get to know each other, you'll get to know us, and we're excited to be able to leverage our proximity to the heart of government.
The calibre of people you're interacting with is like nothing else you'll ever do. Specific things like going to Downing Street, meeting ex-Prime Ministers, Chancellors, senior ministers, etc. But that's what King's does better than anybody else.
It really is the embodiment of knowledge with purpose.
Working really closely with the Treasury, we've had a good 250 different Treasury civil servants come and do our class as part of their job. The Treasury thinks that its current civil servants can learn skills and learn from history in our class.
Our students, having studied British government, find that it's very useful for going into British government. We have students who go on to serve in civil service or to get involved in politics more directly, in business, in government relations, in public policy, in think tanks and in journalism. Ultimately, you're learning a set of skills here that are transferable.
I've got to say, I'd love to have done this class when I was in my 20s, I think it would have really helped me. You see a complete picture of public policy, and we use the lens of history to help us understand the challenges we face today and in the future. I think these are brilliant skills which any politician, policymaker can learn in this class and would really equip them to go on and do those kind of jobs in the future.
Boom. Spread the word, please. Right. Let's move on. So the meat of the evening. Tonight, in partnership with our friends at Workday and Amazon Web Services, policy making in the age of AI, we have our visiting professor, Sarah Munby.
Thank you very much indeed. And I thought I'd start by saying that the words I'm going to use most often, both in this lecture tonight and probably in the Q&A that follows, are some of the most unfashionable words in government. They're not at all liked by civil servants because civil servants like an evidence base and to use that to give you some really fact-based answers and advice, and they're definitely not liked by politicians. And those words are, I don't know. And this talk is sort of in disguise as being a talk about AI, but it's really about how do you manage when the answer to a huge range of fundamental questions that need to inform your policymaking is, I don't know. And not just I don't know personally, but we don't know. Our organisation doesn't know, the organisations we work with don't know, and at its largest scale, humanity doesn't know. Now, why does the topic of I don't know intersect so very neatly with the topic of AI? And I'm going to be talking quite a lot about generative AI tonight. So if you follow Gartner's hype cycle, generative AI is currently placed by Gartner at the exact top of the hype cycle. That's what they call the peak of inflated expectations. And for me, what that kind of brings to life is this is a point of very high uncertainty. We know, on the one hand, there are real challenges. Challenges around the explainability of models, challenges around bias, challenges around hallucinations that come from models when we expect them to give us truth, a whole series of implementation challenges around skills, around SMEs. There's plenty to talk down if that's where you want to go. And because we were talking about learning from history, I couldn't resist digging a little bit into the history of AI and AI policy making. If you ever wanted a technology that's had its journey through that cycle over the last many, many decades, AI is surely it. And in 1973, there was a report written, the Lighthill report, if you want to go and look it up, which was a really important survey of the field in 1973, and immensely influential, not least on government decisions about funding and R&D that came in the subsequent decades. And the key line in Lighthill is that AI is suffering from the lamentable failure of inflated predictions, and that most people who are working in the field are suffering from, I thought this was a good word, embarrassment. And that report is sort of commonly thought to have signaled or caused, depending on how you look at these things, the start of the first AI winter, when suddenly AI had gone from being something that was exciting and an important government priority to being something that was viewed as entirely second order. So it's been overestimated in the past. It's certainly true that there are real challenges, and we may have what Gartner call the trough of disillusionment yet to come. But mistakes get made in the other direction too. And my view, for what it's worth, is that ultimately technologies like this fall firmly under the remit of what many people call Amara's law, which is that we overestimate the short-term impacts of technological change and underestimate the long-term impacts of technological change. And I couldn't resist, if you're a technologist, you will have heard this line before, but not everyone in the audience might have. I couldn't resist quoting everybody's favorite mistake, which is, if you're an economist by background, as I am, Paul Krugman is the sort of person who you really like look up to. You know, I remember when I was an undergraduate, Paul Krugman was, you'd sort of read a well-explained article about the prisoner's dilemma, and you'd think, oh, this guy's very smart. Anyway, this very smart man, in 1998, so not that long ago, wrote, by 2005 or so, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than the fax machines. 10 years from now, the information economy will sound silly as a phrase. So, yeah, it's possible to overhype. It's definitely also possible to underhype. And in the long run, humanity has a fantastic track record of underestimating the profound impact of technological change. So the premise really for what I'm going to say about policy and how we think about policy is that what we are seeing here is a deeply profound technological revolution. The thing is, it has an unknown timing, and it has an unknown impact. If you spend a lot of time reading around this subject, as of course you can imagine I do, the sort of scale that people are measuring potential impact on, I'd say the low end of that scale is something roughly of the impact of the internet. Pretty serious. The high end of that scale is something of the impact of the human taming of fire. That's sort of roughly the spectrum. And there's two things about that spectrum. One is that all the points on it are pretty serious, but the other is it's still incredibly wide. So the question really then for government in facing issues like this is, how do we manage these I don't knows? How do you act? What should you do in the face of serious I don't knows? And I thought I'd talk about a few of the things we don't know and what we might do about that. So the first thing we don't know is we don't know when. So this is self-evidently a really fast-moving territory. Everybody knows that. You will have all seen the kind of exponential curves that are governing progress in AI. And I thought it was worth reflecting that we know from recent evidence, not just in the UK, but around the world, that politics and government is really quite poor at managing an exponential curve. We've had a really good example of that recently, COVID. All the evidence from the inquiry suggests that not just here in the UK, but that in every country around the world, politicians and those who advised them found it very difficult to get their heads round what exponential growth really meant. When you're looking at 10 cases a week, imagining 10,000 cases a week is a kind of a feat that very few people are capable of imagining. And that's exactly the situation that we find ourselves in AI, where we're looking at a thing that exists today and trying to imagine the version that's quite imminent, that is 10 times more, 100 times more, or 1,000 times more. And when you take that analogy from COVID, right, it's not just like that. It's actually much more difficult and much more challenging in terms of understanding what's really happening out there in the world. And I just thought I'd say a few reasons I think that's true. The first is that we get actually quite few data points. So we can talk about how much training data is used for a particular model, how many parameters, and how much is used for the next model, and we can see the 10x or 100x change between them. But in between, you don't get that much on what's really happening. We're only in touch with the frontier at certain moments where the frontier moves forward and we all see it. It moves in a jerky and discontinuous fashion, not a smooth one. And not only that, but there is really not a convenient metric that allows you to see what's happening. I spent quite a lot of my policy life working on climate change, and the contrast between a world in which you have well-established and understood metrics that allow you to see what's happening and kind of govern the system versus a world in which there is no kind of common metric of what is the number that makes you understand how quickly this thing is progressing? I'm not sure just saying it's this many teraflops really gives you a handle on what's happening. Because that's the second issue. Not only is data poor, but the data is typically about the inputs rather than the outputs. And if we've learned one thing over the last months and years, has been that the inputs can produce unpredictable outputs. So, recent example, the Gemini model ultimately being suspended from the market because it was generating pictures of both Vikings and Nazis that were unrealistically ethnically diverse. Now, the interesting thing about that is that had not been managed and predicted by the people releasing the model. And that's just a small, in the scheme of what we're talking about, relatively tactical example of unpredictable results. So we don't know. We can watch the input curve. I can draw you the graph of computing power, joining together those moments when the frontier comes to life. But what I can't tell you is how that will translate into outputs. And it's not just that I can't tell you. The very people who are doing the work can't tell you either. We also don't know when constraints will start to bite. There's a really developed discussion on when do you get to the point where progress isn't exponential anymore. No exponential goes on forever. We all know that. But when does it change? And a huge amount of that debate is around, does data ultimately bite? Do you get to a point where effectively all of the available data has been swallowed up by the models? Where do you go next? And the question then is about, can you make AI-generated data be something that AI itself can learn from? Does the sort of self-learning, bootstrapping kind of model apply here? And therefore, is there almost no constraint on development? And that's what people who think we're not that far away from artificial general intelligence, that's the kind of line of thinking that takes you there. Or do you think actually, once you've got all of the data loaded in and you've kind of reached the amount of processing power that lets you process all of that, you start to reach a limit because you need novel data in order to really learn? And that's a legitimately disputed question, even among people who are deep technical experts in the field. So answering the question of what's happening, how fast, what results will it have, is really difficult. What that means, just to kind of bring to life what it feels like looking at that, what does it mean for policymakers? It means our intuition is very poor because we're operating against a super fast-moving backdrop with unpredictable results. It means our evidence, remember what I said about liking evidence? Our evidence is very rapidly out of date. By the time you have formed a proper evidence base, your evidence base is already old. Information is very asymmetric. There's a good reason why regulatory capture and fears about regulatory capture have been such an important part of the conversation about AI over the last year. That's because knowledge becomes concentrated when it is so fast-moving in a small number of highly technically capable organizations, and the risk of asymmetry of information between government and industry, which is always high in any field of public policy, is really high here. It means our tools are too slow. Most of what government does, of what any government does around the world, is too slow to react to this fast-moving change. And it means that the risk of making a mistake is really high. And ministers have talked about one of the biggest risks in all the work that we do on AI policy is the risk that we take action now that stifles development and innovation that could make a fundamental difference to the human condition. We're talking about the question of whether whether a misstep by policymakers could prevent humanity accessing cures to our most deadly diseases. Those are very serious risks to be carrying. So what do you do about all of that? As I say, really, it's a really difficult problem, and there's kind of many, many individual policy problems tucked in there. I think there are two themes that really matter for government as an institution. The first, simple but hard, is capability. So in that world of low evidence, fast-changing, asymmetric information and understanding, what can you do to try to help? Well, you need to rapidly and seriously invest in government capability. And that, by the way, isn't just sort of literacy. It's about deep technical capability, because really understanding what is going on and what effects it might have and where the limitations might come, that's not something you get on a sort of, a quick sheep dip, although, by the way, that matters too. We've made probably, I think it's fair to say, more investment than any government around the world in technical AI capability in the AI Safety Institute. We've got 30 researchers, and in terms of people who really understand AI safety, that's a huge concentration, by the way, probably more than you could find anywhere in the world, with the possible exception of some of the major model makers themselves. We're collaborating internationally to build expertise. That's why one of the critical outputs from the AI Safety Summit was working with experts right across the world to produce some kind of, it's a work in progress, a consensus view on what the state of the science is. That's another element of investing in capability. Investing in capability in infrastructure, the importance of computing power is utterly vital to being able to make this work. And the UK government's investing over £1.5 billion in UK compute for both the public sector and UK SMEs. So lots happening in this space around capability. But the risk of being outrun is still very, very real. So I think we're going to keep returning to the question of how do we attract the right people to work on these issues for government? How do we train and educate them in a way that makes them able to grapple with what is a kind of, like a level 8 difficulty problem. The second theme, again, a simple one to say but hard to deliver, is if you're operating in a fast-moving world in which your policy tools are being completely outpaced by the results of technological change, then agility in your model is utterly vital. And the thing that's kind of underpinned the UK government's approach to AI regulation has been about trying to disperse work on specific sort of use cases and sectoral issues out into the regulators. And that's partly about making sure that we're specific and careful and context-based in what we do. But it's partly because that kind of regulatory activity can happen at a much faster tick rate than if you sort of centralize into one place. It's not easy, not least because that means we need to have a spread of capability. We've just put an extra £10 million into the funding of regulators' capabilities right across the economy on AI. But my view would be there's going to be more needed from regulators themselves and maybe centrally to manage that. And you look at what other countries are doing, and it's really hard. There's, of course, lots to admire about the approach that the EU are taking, but ultimately the EU AI Act has a implementation timeline, depending on the element of that legislation that you're looking at, has an implementation timeline that is somewhere between 6 months for the most urgent measures, going out to 2 years for a large proportion of that work. And I just think we have to be realistic that in this world, in that fast-moving world I was talking about, 2 years is a lifetime. And there's a serious risk that the work you do today will be completely outdated by the time it actually comes into force. If you look at the United States, at the legislative process, which is difficult, multi-layered, it just can't get it done fast enough to turn kind of idea into reality in terms of regulation and legislation. And I think that raises an interesting sort of reflection for all of us as we look internationally at the different kinds of models that are going to emerge, the different decisions that are going to be taken at all sorts of levels in our political and government systems, which is quite fundamentally, how do you get democratic accountability to operate at the pace of change that you need in order to deliver the kind of policy change that keeps up with the technological change? Because democratic accountability just isn't very quick. That's just not how it tends to operate. And I think we've got a sort of a clock speed challenge. I think there's a huge strength in the way that we're using our regulators. It's an enormous strength of the UK system that we can really build on to be much more agile than many of our peers in this space. But at the same time, it's going to make those questions of accountability and parliamentary accountability and governance really important for the UK, just as they are for everyone else. So capability and agility, big themes. I wouldn't suggest that either of those alone will fix the problem. But, and I think we'll come to this in the discussion, but that's sort of the best we've got for the scale of the challenge that we're facing. There isn't another route to getting us to move faster. So if the first sort of we don't know is we don't know when, there's a kind of even bigger one hiding behind that one, closely related, of course, which is we also don't know what. So change, even rapid change, which is what I've been talking about, is kind of bread and butter for government, actually. We deal with change all the time. It isn't always very easy. Some of it is very sudden and discontinuous and can be really challenging. COVID, I already mentioned. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is another really recent example. That's a quick turnaround on all sorts of different aspects of government policy. So in some ways, I kind of back us to deal with things that emerge quickly that require us to do serious and challenging work. The difficulty about a technological change of this scale and significance is that history shows us incredibly vividly that big technological change can drive really profound shifts in our kind of fundamental operating system, whether that's our economic operating system, our societal operating system, our values. And I'll talk a bit more about that, but just kind of to bring this to life for you, if you go back to what I said at the beginning, which is kind of people who are close to the field are saying this is something on a scale that runs from internet to fire. Other things on that sort of scale, we're talking about the printing press. Okay, what were the second order impacts of the printing press? I think there will be people in this building who are much more qualified to comment than me on the question of whether the invention of the printing press fundamentally influenced the course of religion in Europe, but it's definitely not a stupid question. The way that the steam revolution completely changed distribution of population across the UK, urbanisation, and what that did to both the class and the political system. The internet, I think there are lots of second-order impacts of the internet that we did not really predict. I don't think we really predicted the way that the internet would change how we fall in love, or the way the internet would change how people and how often people have sex, or the way the internet would change the way that young people make friends and build their communities. Those are the sorts of second-order, potentially profound impacts that I think are inherently very hard to predict. We don't know, and we are not about to know. It isn't something that just another look at the data will reveal to us in advance. And there are lots of examples of this in the field of AI. So I'll just do a few, but I was tempted to do many, 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 because it's a sort of endless seam you can mine, and you should, by the way, because when you start thinking about this, it's you really are opening Pandora's box. So let's just do a few just to illustrate. So security and geopolitics. So we've got some first-order effects, the risk of cyber attacks, and what that means for how we need to think about defense. That's a difficult problem, but it's one that we're reasonably well equipped to kind of understand, recognize, and deal with. But many people in the field think that the impact on security and geopolitics will be very much more profound. And I thought to illustrate this, it was good to look at what Suleiman says. So his kind of view of what will happen is a colossal transfer of power away from traditional states. A huge scale of impact essentially driven by things like the fact that one person can now control 1,000 drones. Now, the question of how the emergence of AI and the strengthening of AI as a both offensive and defensive security tool will change the national security calculus is one that we absolutely have got people thinking about. But my guess would be that they won't know. That's sort of where, that's kind of where the logic takes you. It's a bit like until you get nuclear weapons, the way that nuclear weapons will change kind of fundamental security concepts about deterrence and international interactions, it's not clear to you. It's like going back and asking the Tudors and the Stuarts to think about questions of how you should set railway gauge policy before the invention of the steam engine. It's just a very difficult intellectual leap to make. Take another topic, truth and information. So we're dealing with the first order changes in the information environment now. If you pay any attention to AI whatsoever, you will have seen the concern about the role that mis- and disinformation could play in upcoming elections across the world. That in its own right is already a serious and challenging public policy problem on which we're working hard. But the second order effects of the changing information environment are potentially really, really profound, particularly as AI and generative AI move into being really accurate in the audio, image, and video spaces. Because we're pretty fundamentally hardwired to see those as sources of truth. And quite what happens when our cave person brains have to confront a reality in which image and audio and video and identity no longer hold as sources of truth, particularly when you start to layer that on top of a virtual reality, meta-reality kind of setup. I don't know. I don't know what that does to our ideas about free speech. I don't know what that does to how trust between humans changes. I think those are going to be really big questions. In the industrial sphere, we know that there's a series of first-order effects about rapid and potentially dramatic improvements in productivity. We can all start to think about what the kind of immediate consequences of that are. Massive need for new skills, industries that have been previously quite unaffected by prior waves of automation and robotics, in the service sectors being really dramatically changed. But what are the second-order economic effects that we can't even see yet? What are the industries that will be created that we haven't predicted? The Uber or the influencer sector of AI, it isn't visible yet. And when we were first digging up oil, we didn't know about the car, and we didn't know about plastics, and where are those industries going to come from? Even for government itself, we've got some huge first-order problems that we are doing a lot of work on about making sure that we can implement AI within government and the public sector to the benefit of the citizen. That's tough in its own right. We need great data, more open data. We need people with the right skills. We need really clear ethical standards about how we implement it. Yes, all of that. I think there are some really interesting second-order questions as well. We're pretty used to, in government, a chain where ultimately decisions are made by an individual. Our system, the system that I kind of live my daily life in, is built around a system where decisions are taken by a Secretary of State or another minister on the basis of some evidence that has been provided to them and are kind of fully explainable right down the chain. But we're definitely going to get to a point where ministers will be making decisions based on evidence that's arisen from AI that may not be fully explainable, or where we give them recommendations for improving public outcomes, but we can't explain why those recommendations work or where they came from. So there are a ton more things that you could put on that list. Education and childhood, how we think about inclusion and diversity, criminal law, justice, commercial liability. Almost everything has a kind of series of first order and then profound second order impacts. And I should say I don't have the answer to this. And I don't think there really is an answer. I think I don't know is the right answer. And anyone who claims that they can tell you what is going to happen and define what we should do about it now is, in my view, overreaching. But two thoughts. The first is around really joint working and cross-fertilization of ideas. If we're going to understand these kind of changes, we need to be able to bring together people from different kinds of community and different kinds of expertise to get at ideas that require a leap of imagination, not just a kind of analysis of evidence. The second is understanding scenarios and leading indicators and being able to observe what's happening early. So even though I can't tell you now what will happen, I would like to know what are some of the paths that we might go down and how would we know what was emerging. The Government Office for Science have done some really good work on potential scenarios for the development of AI that I think really starts to go into this place of thinking about what the possibilities are and how we might know when they're coming up. And the final big uncertainty, if we don't know when, we don't know what. I think it's also important to note that we very often don't know who. And what I mean by that is if you take those challenges around fast-moving context, around the potential for profound change, and you move them out of a domestic context into an international context, then things get sort of like much more complicated quite quickly. You've got a whole series of different dynamics, a kind of economically competitive dynamic where we're interested in building our own AI strength. Really important question for the UK because we're currently clearly kind of the number 3 player in this industry with only the US and China ahead. It's a huge opportunity for us. But at the same time, we need to think about how are the concentration, the profit and economic concentration dynamics going to emerge in this industry? What do we need to do? Where are we competing? Where are we not? You've got a whole security dynamic where we've got shared risks globally that we need to work on together. You've got a values dynamic where we're talking, people like to talk about AI models and whether they're aligned and the alignment of AI models. But when we've got fundamentally different ethical structures in different parts of the world, I'm wondering what these AI models are going to be aligned to is a pretty profound international question. So I think this is another area where we do not have all of the answers, but we're doing some right things. One of the things that I really appreciated about the work that we did on the AI Safety Summit was a very simple one, which is that it was about accelerating the discussion. Because I worry about pace here. I worry about pace domestically and our ability to be agile and respond to a rapidly emerging situation. The world of international diplomacy is not known for its ability to operate quickly with a high clock speed. And I think we really managed to do something about accelerating the conversation there. How do we seek real multilateralism? Another thing I would sort of highlight from the summit was there was a lot of debate in the media and in public about invitees and the role of China. And actually, our ability to convene a discussion that went beyond just talking to our most like-minded allies feels really important. That's going to, over time, need to do even more to include the Global South in a set of conversations where we don't yet quite understand the dynamics at work. Again, I compare it to climate change, where I think we've got quite a good grip on the international dynamics. What are the interests of different countries, and how do those play out? By the way, often badly. It's not easy, but I think we can describe quite well, why countries do what they do and how it drives results. I don't think we're quite there yet on AI. So overall, I think we should be really clear that there are lots of questions that we don't know the answer to. Not as a way of stepping back from the difficulties, but as a way of leaning into the real difficulties around how we build a government system, both domestically and internationally, that has the capabilities and tools to deal with what's going to continue to be an emergent situation. This state of I don't know-ness is not about to kind of be closed. It's going to continue for some time, and we need to be able to thrive and operate in it. We need to be responsive and learning. And I would say, I think the UK is doing a pretty good job on the foundations of this. The building of capability, the building of an agile model, really leaning into an international multilateral response on many of these issues. But ultimately, for us and other governments around the world, the changes that we're making can feel quite linear. They are sort of changes that, by their nature, are quite linear. And the risk of being outpaced by the exponential is quite real. And on the one hand, if I sort of compare us, as it were, to the other antelopes internationally, and I sort of think, I think we're doing a pretty good job here, actually. I'm not sort of envying and looking over my shoulder. I'm definitely looking to learn and to share with other countries, but I think there's a lot to celebrate in our approach. So when I'm looking kind of sideways, I feel quite good. But when you turn around and you sort of see the lions behind you, you start to feel a bit more worried. And so we need to, across all of these dimensions around capability and agility, scenario planning, international engagement, we need to be able to take all of those things and kind of push that admittedly linear journey as close to the vertical as we can to manage a world in which I think I don't know is going to remain an excellent answer to many of the questions we face for some time.
Thank you. Wow. I don't know. Very difficult for a university, that as well, to actually be teaching. But I think that it's just so profound. When you're talking about how technologies of the past have changed so much, one of the interesting things that I muse on occasions are the incredible evolutions that happened, in the late 19th, early 20th century, with like the telegraph, the cars, aviation, and to what extent that actually destabilised the world in advance of the First World War. I think that you can't put that on a graph. You can't actually say this led to that, but undoubtedly it destabilised. Just incredible to be musing on these incredible developments, and we're only at the beginning of it, right? Only at the beginning. Okay, well, I imagine that there's 1,000 questions. Can I have name and affiliation? Keep it nice and brief, and we'll get as many questions in as possible. Who's first? That gentleman over there. Have we got any mics or not? Yeah, mic. Is there one mic? 2 mics. There we go. Bingo. There we are. We've got this man right down the front here, as far away as possible, right down the front. That's it. Did you put your trainers on, Jack?
Thank you. As a company director who spent 2017 and 18 asking absolutely everyone I could get in front of, how do I do business in Europe? And 100% of my respondents said, I don't know. I feel your pain. My question is, you touched briefly on the need to avoid things that might delay response to things that emerge, which of course is what patents do. And then you said you have a need for increased open data, which then impinges on copyright. So I'd like to know what you don't know about intellectual property.
So there's quite a few things to unpick in intellectual property. I didn't talk, and could definitely have been added to the list of tricky problems, about the impact of AI on the creative industries, where there's a really live question about copyright and what you do about that, and how you make sure that you're protecting the interests of content creators, while at the same time not putting a kind of hard brake on your AI industry. And if you follow this, you'll know that that is a problem that government is working on. It's definitely a difficult one in which there is no sort of straightforward compromise that makes it all work. There's also a lot of live court cases on exactly that question, not just here but internationally as well. It's kind of you can sort of follow that evolution kind of daily and weekly. So that set of issues is. I think it's in the sort of first order category, i.e. will get understood and fixed within kind of a recognisable timeline. By the way, then a whole load of second order creativity impacts that one could come to. And the other thing that your question made me think about, which I again didn't speak about, is the really challenging policy questions around open source. So, open data, as it applies to public data, is a relatively sort of straightforward. We all definitely believe in making more public data open. The difficulty is actually making that happen, but it's not sort of philosophically difficult. But when it comes to AI models, there are really divergent views about the role that open source plays, with everything from, open source is a serious danger, a serious danger to, at its most extreme statement, people would say a serious danger to humanity, that there are people at that end of the spectrum, through to we will never have a safe system of fundamental AI models if we do not access open source. And I don't think any government around the world has yet got a kind of a really clear answer to that question. And I think it is reasonable to say that that is currently still, and worryingly and uncomfortably, in the category of we don't know.
Thank you.
Right here, yes? No? Yeah. You had your hand up earlier, that's right. Yeah, that's it. Along the aisle here.
Hello, thanks. That was very interesting. My name is Ben Hawes. I'm a tech policy consultant, a former civil servant, and actually the first person to work on AI policy in the digital economy directorate in DCMS some years ago. And actually, a few years before, I worked on the review of intellectual property, so I really feel your pain here. I always thought one of the very challenging things in government was with digital, but AI kind of accelerated it, was that you have the verticals and you have the horizontals, and you both need an AI office, and then you need every other bit of government to understand how it affects them. And those are actually two quite different questions to run at the same time. And I suppose, I mean, even within technology policy, you know, is it fully understood that if you relax how an individual can protect themselves against uses of data about them, you are actually also regulating uses of AI on that data about them? And I wonder if you know, do other parts of government understand that all sorts of areas of their regulation may also be regulation of AI?
I think at that level, yes, not least because of the work that we're doing now on the on making sure that regulators from across the government system are working on AI as it affects their own domains. Many of them are actually pretty well advanced on that already. You might have seen the CMA have recently put out quite a lot of work on the foundation model industry, for example. But that dynamic of trying to run a delegated system where you want all bits of government to be operating, because, by the way, speed, like too much centralization is the enemy of moving in an agile way, right? We're wanting people to be able to go after problems. On the one hand, that's completely true. And on the other hand, we've got a massively interconnected issue here in which you know, one of the difficulties is even being able to sort of you know, parse and structure the problem in a way that allows people to work on it. I'm not saying that what we're doing is kind of completely original and has never been tried before, but it's about having a balanced model where you do have centres of expertise, particularly when expertise is really really in short supply. I think it's actually important to bring people together so that you're not just dispersing the expertise right across the system. So a centre of expertise, actually quite strong central governance. So things like we're asking all of the regulators, the relevant regulators, to come back to us by the end of April, I think the deadline is, with kind of their own approaches and strategies so that we can understand where the strengths and weaknesses are. You need all of that, but at the same time, you need to resist the temptation to kind of create a sort of a unit of AI. You know, it's a bit like, I think this applies to lots of the things that my department does. On the one hand, we are the Department of Science, but on the other hand, every department is a science department, and you need to manage that kind of tension and interface constantly. So I guess I'm just embracing your question and saying I think we're exactly trying to find that balance as we go forward.
Who's next? Yeah, I've got loads. Here we go. There's one at the back there, hand up for a while. That's it. Yep, right there. Thank you.
Hi there, Jay Asher, I work at Airbus. If I can, a slightly cheeky sort of hypothetical question for the future. Imagine a scenario where the civil service has adopted sort of one type of AI or one model for its decision making, but a minister, as we know, young people at the moment are already using AI, and future ministers may sort of have this sort of readily available to them. If a minister opens another that sort of fundamentally disagrees, what advice would you give to a future PermSec in resolving that difference?
The first thing is I love the positive world in which the civil service has managed to align on one solution for almost any kind of problem. I think that kind of issue is going to come up all the time. So I don't think that will be a kind of an unexpected question when it arises. And I don't think it will be a question kind of for the permanent secretary. You know, maybe one time it'll be a new question, but it'll actually be part of our daily experience, not just in government, but in every industry. And I don't think it's so different from what we have now, which is we have all sorts of analytical sources of insight, and boy, they don't always agree. So I feel sort of moderately comfortable about managing that. The difficulty, as I mentioned, the thing that I think is quite profound for government is the potential lack of explainability. So, what do you do when you start to see from an AI model a warning about something, for example, where you can't understand what generated that warning and you can't interrogate the evidence base in the same way that we're used to? And are you prepared to put kind of public, not just money, but effort of all kinds into managing that warning? And what if you don't? I think those are going to be quite tricky trade-offs in what will inevitably be a period of uncertainty. I would hope that both in government and broader society, our kind of systems and thinking will mature to be able to manage those sorts of things, but there will undoubtedly be a patch where we don't have the level of confidence and literacy that we would want in order to manage those issues.
Thank you. Okay. Over there, yep. Daniel, yep.
Thank you. Daniel Kremen, Director of Public Affairs and Insight at King's. My question would be two-layered, and they're kind of interconnected. One is the capability point you raised, which is really vital. And we know, public sector salary challenges around retention can definitely be a problem, particularly where you've got high-tech areas. There's an allure, there's a drag to the private sector. Are you thinking imaginatively about sort of visiting fellowships within government and secondments into industry as a way of bridging the knowledge gap and keeping current? What kind of arrangements are there? And I think you kind of talked as well, the second point was around that pro-innovation environment for regulation, the regulatory ecosystem that is pro-innovation. Really important strand of the innovation strategy. What are we doing there, do you think, that is distinct internationally to kind of keep us at the cutting edge of it? But also, are we in adopting that pro-innovation outlook, are we also squaring it with risk assessment, perhaps, around the pace of change of some of these models, and what you talked about, that the public consent for AI as a decision-making tool in everyday consumer tools? Are we thinking enough about that as well? While I'm really pro the innovation kind of attitude to regulation and to deregulation, are we also bringing the public with us enough on that journey?
So lots in there. So I was smiling while you were asking your question about sort of secondments and fellowships, because I've got one of my colleagues here, Helen Freeman, who runs our expert exchange program, which we operate across the department, which is exactly designed to do a much better job than government has historically about bringing in external talent for short periods. I don't think that's just about AI, that's a much broader problem. Your question about technical talent, so I should at this point say, any technical talent in the audience, please do check out our adverts for roles in the AI Safety Institute. We are recruiting, and you'll be glad to hear that for those roles, we are recruiting at salaries above what we would be paying an equivalently graded civil servant. That, by the way, is difficult. Like, that is uncomfortable in all sorts of ways. But that is the reality of the market that we're operating in. So kind of yes and yes to your questions about talent. To the question about balancing risk and innovation, I mean, yeah, isn't that the heart of many of these kind of current questions that we face? Where are you going too hard? Where are you going too soft? We've got now quite a sort of sophisticated risk approach in which we are, I mean, so it sounds terribly basic, but identifying and tracking and assigning risks right across the governmental system so that we can make sure we're not kind of missing elements of the picture. I think that's really important. And at the same time, trying to use the toolkit that has been so successful in the UK, actually, about using innovation in many different areas to drive, using regulation to support innovation. The one comment I would make on that is we spend a lot of time in sort of other bits of our forest talking about approaches that essentially could be summarised by saying sandboxes of various different kinds. And that can be incredibly powerful. But on some of this AI stuff, it might be a bit late. The things that's kind of already out of the sandbox. So that's why I think it's so important that we get the whole regulatory structure to move rapidly, but in an innovation-enhancing way, because the game is moving so quickly. Compare something like quantum or fusion, where those kind of more contained sandbox approaches, I think, have an enormous amount of value to bring.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question down here and another one down here, so if we can follow up these quite quickly. There we are. I'm genuinely not trying to just do random to make you move faster. Please.
Thank you. Yatin Mahandri from Cognizant. Thank you, Sarah. Very interesting talk. My question was, look at the white paper response on AI, and I did, and I spoke at the APPG on it, and there was a lot of good stuff in there. Algorithmic transparency, lots of words on regulation, and as you said, the regulators getting their funding to report by the end of April. Innovation was hidden deep within, I think, page 8 or 9 of the 100 or so. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on how government can harness AI and be an innovator and give that impetus, because rather than leave it to the private sector to do. That was really my question.
And just to make sure I understand your question, you mean about government using AI in its
use
own...
of AI as opposed to government's role as a regulator?
Yes, huge. You might have seen, actually, the Chancellor announced as part of his budget announcements this morning a really significant expansion in IAI, which is the sort of central area of gathering expertise. I think this expertise point comes up again here, right? It's a different kind of expertise. It's not quite the sort of like understanding the frontier. It's more about like, can you actually implement change across government? I think it's hugely important. And the only reason really for not kind of making it a central plank of what I said is I don't want to suggest it's easy. We know that implementing digital and data-driven systems in government is really quite hard, but ultimately it is a moderately well understood problem. I think the challenges for government around skills, around whether the existing processes are sufficiently digitized, about whether we really understand our data and have it in a form that we could even use to feed. Those are questions that every sort of corporate boardroom across both Britain and the world is grappling with right now, and I think they apply in a not identical, but a similar way in the public sector. And back to the point about talent, this is going to be an area where that interchange and bringing in people who've been there and done that is really important. And if you look back on the history of digital and data implementation in HMG, I don't think I'm sort of breaking a confidence if I say I think most observers would say we were too slow. We were behind the private sector, and we need to work much harder to. We may not be operating at the implementation frontier in our own applications, because those issues about transparency and bias and so on, which are important in the private sector, are critical in the public sector. But we need to at least be in sight of that frontier. We need to be operating somewhere that relates to the frontier.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Grant Fitzner, Office for National Statistics. Amongst the things I'm responsible for is the Public Services Productivity Review measurement. A hot topic at the moment, actually, and of course the Chancellor talked quite a bit about the public sector earlier today. We published some research earlier in the week that said that public sector workers actually welcome AI, provided it's implemented sensibly, an important caveat, and there's oversight. But I'm not sure there's as much AI innovation in the public sector, certainly at the moment, than you or I would probably want. And I think one of the barriers there is the minute you start talking about something like ChatGPT, your security guys are kind of starting to frown and saying, we're trying to block you from using various tools and all the rest of it, because of course there are obvious security concerns, particularly when you have confidential data that you're dealing with. But I was really struck that you talked a lot about regulation. You didn't talk much about competition. I used to work in the NHS. There were lots of good ideas, but they didn't disseminate, they didn't spread, and there was not a lot of effort by the organisation to promulgate lots of competition and basically try things. And I think AI is a classic example where if you had lots of people across the public sector just playing around and trying stuff, people would find really interesting innovations more quickly than maybe a more conventional approach might.
Another question with lots packed into it. Maybe I'll say just a couple of things. The first is, I think one of the interesting things about generative AI in particular is the way that we're seeing, not just in the public sector, but right across society and the economy, a sort of bottom-up adoption. So there are lots and lots of people who are starting to kind of use this in their daily life. It's not that you're sort of waiting for corporate to kind of push it down onto you. You're hungry for what it can deliver. I think that's true in lots and lots of fields, and I'm sure we've got the same thing with public servants too, and that's why it's been so important for us to work with the central digital teams to make sure we've got clear guidance for civil servants about what you can and can't do. You know, in our department, like many others, we've got access to kind of safe corporate tools that we can use that in effect are kind of enterprise-grade large language models. So lots of sort of practicalities to deal with there. I think your kind of broader point about how do we properly harness the energy to innovate in the public sector is a really important one that goes far beyond the use of AI, and you know, the idea that civil servants and public servants should feel that their management at every level, right up to and including Permanent Secretary, is interested in and going to support new ways of doing things. I think there's a lot to unpack there. I'll do a tiny plug. This is one of the things that's kind of occupying me at the moment when I'm not worrying about AI policy. We've just had an external review done of our departmental business case policies and processes, basically designed to kind of massively streamline the kind of weight of process that we sometimes use to manage risk. And I think we need to be much clearer about where we, as an organisation, are risk-seeking and risk-taking, not just risk managing.
Thank you. Yep. Right there.
Thank you for that wonderful, insightful lecture. My question, and I currently work as a communications officer at the City of London Corporation. So my question ties into the role that the local government can play in supporting the work of the central government on AI and technological advancement. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think this probably links back to what we've been talking about in the last couple of questions around how do you really harness the power of AI to improve citizen outcomes. And that has got to be true at every level of government. And I think it also goes to the question that we talked about around data and data access, and how across the public sector do we get better at making sure that data is moving appropriately and in the right way. I mean, this isn't, you know, I'm not sure this is the place where I would be kind of maximally risk hungry. How do we make sure that data is being shared so that the work that is happening locally to drive insight is kind of docked into the work that's happening centrally? And as we see the scale of benefit that we can gain from using in all senses our data in this context is a huge topic, right? Not just the sort of, you know, the file of numbers. How we're using that to drive insight, I hope that as we sort of see the power of that, it's going to drive us towards closer working on all those sorts of topics.
Did I see a question there? Yeah, right there.
Thank you. So it's Monica from PwC. I work on the regulation strategy of AI. But I have a question which is a little bit forward for the future. What's the government thoughts on the interoperability? Because right now when we talk about AI, we only focus on the AI, but what will happen if we connect it with, for example, the blockchain and the crypto market or the metaverse and the VR, because those technologies will inevitably connect. Does government think about connecting those topics and moving forward somehow? When AI is already very complex.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think you put your finger on something really important about. I'm never sure how much I like the word convergence, but a convergence of different technologies and the way that they interact. I mean, and isn't that just another thing to kind of add to the complexity of the issues that we're managing? So yes, we absolutely do think about that. At the same time, there is a risk of creating a universe so complex that you're not able to kind of enact change. So the sort of the place that my thinking on that topic is particularly concentrated at the moment is, you probably know that the UK government's identified 5 kind of priority technologies, of which AI is one, engineering, biology is another, semiconductors. And let's at least start to get a handle on how those 5 interact and converge, and what new opportunities and maybe threats that embraces. But I think it also goes to this, what I was saying about kind of second-order effects. If we're going to be able to think intelligently about issues that have this level of richness and complexity, we need to be able to draw on not just a kind of a small, central policy world, but actually we need to be drawing on the research and innovation strengths of, the country and beyond, enormously strong university system, corporate innovation system, all of that. It's not all going to come from HMG.
Okay, we've got time for 2 very quick questions here. One here, and then that gentleman there who's had his hand up. Yeah.
Sarah, Tom Hurd, former civil servant. I co-led the creation of the Online Safety Bill, so a piece of regulation in and around the internet. I now run a company that finds through data the best AI scientists and engineers in the world, so I'm very happy to help you out find that talent. And I'm working with DCIT in a few areas linked to it. My question was that you talk that we're at the period of hype, and we may now be going into the trough of despondency, most likely caused by a fundamental breakdown in trust in the systems that are being built, and then a breakdown in the market that provides them. That's usually a time when governments step in when there's a failure in the market. Is there any scenario planning around the UK kite marking or adopting its own frontier AI model that aligns with our values and an accuracy of truth that we believe in? The analogy would be, you talked about roads and railway gauges. Well, we drive on the left-hand side of the road, and we have different railway gauges to many other countries. Can you see a way in which there is a fragmentation and countries go their different way rather than adopting the American model?
Thank you. And if we'll have that second question at the same time, please.
Yeah, thanks. And this relates. So Nathan Branson from Ipsos Mori. So we do a lot around public acceptability. So even before AI, we saw lots of use cases of other technologies. And related to the fact that you're pursuing a context-specific regulatory model, if you don't engage on in the specific context, on the specific use, like the use of personal health data, and the public perceives something to be unfair, even if the system is creating better outcomes and removing biases, that can be a massive brake on innovation. And so I think it relates to Tom's question. How are you thinking about working with the regulators? Because you're asking them to take on a huge amount of risk there if you're asking them to innovate, and they're not really incentivized to take that risk because they're thinking about the next exam algorithm or something like that. So that's how you think about that.
Thank you.
So I do think your question kind of illustrates, though, that context specificity in how we regulate really, really matters. That is why it is so dangerous to make kind of simplistic statements about what is acceptable where. the citizen has different views about what is acceptable in different applications, and I think that's absolutely right. You know, I think we would all be in that camp. And I do worry about the incidents that happen in kind of one part of the system, not just in the public sector, but it'll only take a small number of kind of really significant trust-breaking moments to cause us a challenge in further implementation. We can do, within the public sector, we can do all sorts of things to try and help manage that. So we've been working to make sure that every part of the civil service and public service is kind of applying a common set of transparency standards around algorithms, for example. That's the sort of thing that kind of helps you, establish common ways of doing things that build shared trust. But I think going beyond the public sector, we should probably expect there to be moments where trust is weakened, because we will never have optimized implementation right across the global private sector, right? Things are going to happen. And there will be different contexts and different waves across time. I'm not sure that I necessarily believe that we're about to kind of enter the kind of the moment of disillusionment. That's kind of what, that's what your classic Gartner curve says is going to happen. I think that's a risky prediction to make right now. To the question about sovereign models, there's a pretty big obstacle to doing that, which is these models are really expensive. The compute power that you need is it's already large, and it is, remember, rapidly accelerating at an exponential rate. So the decision to do that is one that would have enormously profound consequences for public finances. And I'm also not necessarily sure it would work. Sovereign capability of that type, it doesn't have an enormously brilliant track record across other fields. But that doesn't mean that the question of how we, even just governmentally, make sure that we have access to really trusted models, just as an example, although it's not the only one, but for all of the secure work that we do, that is a really critical question. But I am not sure that the response to that should be that we will build a kind of a state-led walled garden at the scale of a fundamental foundation model. And ultimately, I think we will see ever more clearly over time that we're going to see, I don't think I'm saying anything particularly wild here, by the way, that we're going to see, the sort of the core foundation models for a reason, because things will be built on top of them, applications, and so on, just like has happened in every other kind of digital operating environment that we've seen. So I think all of those questions that you're asking about how government plays in that space will be really relevant. Do I foresee us building a sort of kind of a Brit GPT? I'm not convinced.
Thank you very much. Okay, brings an end to our proceedings. We've got drinks here just outside those doors there. Martin's guarding them carefully. The next event, I humbly say, is my inaugural lecture in 2 weeks' time, so you can strike that one from your calendars. Now, all that's left for me to say is you might not know, but it's quite Socratic, isn't it? What you don't know, the wisdom there. I mean, to be all over, it's simple for me to say, but to be all over all of these different policy areas, I think personally, it's quite a brave lecture you've given there, especially that it's recorded.
That's a very dangerous word for someone who works in government. Brave, that's not what you want.
And I used it advisedly. Anyway, would you please join me in thanking Sarah? Wonderful stuff. Wonderful stuff. The second of many, right? Oh, yeah, look at that.